You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 15th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio.
A ceasefire between Israel and Hamas appears imminent. Spain attempts to discourage foreigners from buying such properties as are available. And do swimming pools need dress codes? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Rachel Cunliffe and Simon Brooke will discuss the day's big stories, and our On This Day historical feature will reflect on the New World Order, which seemed briefly all the rage in the early 1990s. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and we will have more from our panel very shortly. But first, to news breaking within the last hour. A ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas appears to have been done. I'm joined now from Jerusalem by Nimrod Goren, president and founder of the Israeli foreign policy think tank Mitvim. Nimrod, welcome to the show. What do we know for sure?
Thank you, Andrew. Well, it's something that we've been waiting for a long time, and people in our region, both in Gaza, both in Israel, have a sigh of relief this evening. What we know is that there is a formal announcement that Israel and Hamas, with mediation by Qatar, by Egypt, especially by the Americans, with heavy involvement of the incoming administration, the Trump team, have reached an agreement on a ceasefire in Gaza, which is split into phases. So at the moment, we are talking about a 6-week phase one, in which 33 Israeli hostages, unfortunately not all of them alive, will be released gradually, in which the Israeli military will redeploy and withdraw from some part of the Gaza Strip, enabling some of the Palestinians to go back to their homes, and release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel. That is a very big thing after 15 months of fighting, after the terror attack of October 7, and people really feel a bit more optimistic in our region today.
As far as we can tell from the details, though, is this significantly different from any agreements which have been floated, discussed, and then abandoned before?
This is a very big source of frustration, at least in Israel, because when you look at the draft, and of course we don't know all the details, the ceasefire was just announced over the last hour, but it seems to be very similar to the same formulas that were debated 6, 7, 8 months ago and were rejected at the time. And during those months, some of the hostages died, soldiers died, citizens in Gaza died. So people paid a heavy price for this lingering. And I think the question that people may be not ready to ask now, but will ask in the coming weeks is what happened? Why couldn't it have been done before? People attribute a lot of the credit for this change to the pressure that was now put by Trump that wasn't really there when Biden was mediating for the same ceasefire, enabling both Netanyahu and Hamas to kind of find a way to walk out of that. Now it seems like they faced a pressure that did not enable them to back off.
I mean, we should be clear that this isn't absolutely a done deal yet. The office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that there are still, and I quote, several unresolved clauses, but they do hope that details will be finalized in coming hours. Assuming that this does actually go ahead and that hostages do start to get released possibly as soon as Sunday, how politically difficult is managing the homecoming going to be for Benjamin Netanyahu? Because he has been blamed by a lot of hostage families for the fact that they've been held this long.
Yes, you're right. It's still not formal, and tomorrow there will be a vote in the Israeli government. There will be a majority, and I think it will be approved. There are two aspects to that. One is those elements, the far-right elements within the Israeli government, that oppose the deal and are going to perhaps vote against it. They do not have the ability to shift the majority. Also, some of the opposition parties in Israel already assured Netanyahu and the public that they will support it. So Netanyahu will have the majority. There will be an opposition within his coalition, but as long as there is no formal declaration that the war is ended and IDF withdraws totally, their threats or their opposition to the deal does not go beyond a certain threshold about toppling the coalition. Now, on the other hand, there are sensitivities within the hostage families because there are a number of hostages, quite a number, that will not be coming back in the first phase. And there's a lot of concern whether the first phase will actually be continuing into the second. So 33 will come home, but what about the other 60 plus that their fate may not be known? So I think over time, as this gradual process goes by, you will see more and more pressure from the Israeli public on Netanyahu to continue this process. About 70% of the Israeli public, including people on the right, want the war to end in return for a full release of hostages. And now when there is a chance, I think the public will raise their voice. I think the American administration will make clear that that's what they want. For Netanyahu, the second phase will be more politically challenging at home than implementing the first one.
We are, of course, still waiting for details of what happens in the next 6 weeks. But is anybody, whether within the framework of these discussions or outside it, talking in Israel about what happens after 6 weeks? What happens ideally once this ceasefire becomes permanent? Do we yet know, after nearly 18 months of war, what the idea is of what Gaza will be like and be governed like in future?
Not really. So you have an horizon for after the 6 weeks, because the ceasefire, as it has been debated, has 2 or 3 phases that go beyond the first 6 weeks and spell out what will happen later, mostly in terms of the practical aspects of hostage return, Israeli military withdrawal. The big question on governance, on the future of Gaza, on what role Hamas will or will not have, I think those questions are still blurred. Partly because the day after plans that were discussed throughout the war, people did not see eye to eye on them. The vision of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is very different than what the international community largely wants to see happening. The pro-peace position is let's bring the Palestinian Authority that is in control of the West Bank to take charge of the Gaza Strip instead of Hamas, with the support of regional international actors, creating a pathway for a two-state solution, for more normalization between Israel and the Arab world, especially with the Saudis. Netanyahu is not on board with that at the moment. Will that change? Will there be more additional US pressure on that? We'll see. I think it's an ideological position by Netanyahu that goes in contrast to what many Israelis and many in the world want to see. And that, I think, will create friction later on and may lead us to miss the opportunity of really reshaping reality in Gaza in a way that moves us closer to longer-term stability and peace, rather than to prolong conflict, maybe in a different type of intensity. And that's one of the question marks that are still out there.
Well, just finally for the moment then, Hamas is still clearly a coherent enough entity that they have been participating in these talks, participating in these negotiations. Do we again, and I know it's hard because there's been almost no independent coverage of what's been going on in Gaza, do we have any idea of how reduced or otherwise they have been by nearly 18 months of conflict?
So we see the damage in Gaza. So first, what you see in terms of how villages and cities look like, how many people were killed, how many Hamas officers and units were dismantled. So the situation of Hamas in Gaza is totally different than what it was before October 7th. And I don't think it could be seen as a viable governing power anymore, especially when I think all the relevant actors beyond Israel even do not want to see it continue to cling to power. The major question is whether Arab countries that were involved in the mediation, that were seeking a role for themselves in the day after the war, will see this ceasefire as a good enough step to legitimize their involvement in Gaza, supporting the Palestinian Authority, enabling recovery, reconstruction. If Arab countries will be willing to now engage on what's happening in Gaza, they didn't want to do it before because Israel was still militarily active there. I think that will signal that a shift from the role that Hamas had to a different type of governance, more moderate, more internationally recognized, more positive, I think, for the people of Gaza and the region, will be in the making. But I think it's a bit too early for that. First, we'll need to see that this first phase of the ceasefire is actually implemented. It's a prolonged one. We are talking about 6 weeks. A lot of things can happen on the ground. Stability is not really the characteristics of our region at the moment. So let's see that the first phase is being implemented successfully, and then hopefully the positive momentum will be continued to other aspects as well.
Nimrod Goren, thank you very much for joining us. There will, of course, be more on this breaking story across Monocle Radio's programmes tomorrow, beginning at 7 a.m. London time with The Globalist. You're listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined now, after that short breaking news mandated delay, by tonight's panel, Rachel Cunliffe, Associate Political Editor of The New Statesman, and Simon Brooke, the journalist and communications consultant. Hello to you both.
Hello. Good evening.
And welcome back, and Happy New Year, etc. We are catching up this week on what our various panellists actually did with their Christmases. Rachel, as I understand it, yours was sort of a multi-faith endeavour.
Yeah, this was a real sort of cultural blend. So I'm Jewish, my husband's Christian, or at least C of E by, I don't know, culturally tradition or whatever. And Hanukkah is usually early in December, but this year we had a leap month, which happens every so often, which meant that the first of Hanukkah's 8 nights began on Christmas Day.
This is a quirk of the lunar calendar.
Yes. So the Jewish calendar is the lunar calendar. The lunar calendar is shorter than the solar calendar. Every so often you shove an extra month in there and Hanukkah moves, and this caused chaos. We started off, he took me to midnight mass for Christmas Eve, which I'd never been to before, which was very, very beautiful. And then we went to my in-laws for Christmas Day and had the full Christmas experience, but I brought a Hanukkah and candles, and we lit candles as well, and nobody burst into flame, nothing burst into flame, and then we returned from that and did our big family Hanukkah celebration, and he made it up to me for the whole church thing by cooking potato latkes for 30 members of my family.
That's a heroic effort.
It's a lot of luck because the potato peelings clogged the sink.
Simon, did you get up to anything as logistically and indeed philosophically complicated?
I'm still thinking of the potato latkes, I have to say. Have you got any spare going?
I know, you've just made everybody hungry,
Exactly.
Rachel.
I'll bring some next time.
Apparently a lot of people on Christmas Day book a holiday, and I waited a couple of days later, but decided this was the year that we would go to Japan. It's somewhere where I've always wanted to go, and so we bit the bullet, and we've just booked the flights, but we're going for 3 weeks in and out of Tokyo. But what we're going to do over the next few months is think about where we want to go in Japan. I'm very keen to go to the north. I love the idea of somewhere remote and barren and perhaps even snow-covered. And I love the idea of the contrast between sort of Tokyo, one of the most manically modern cities in the world, and then going somewhere on the trails where you're in the pine woods and there's silence and nothing. So, yeah, that's the plan.
Do I recall correctly that you have been attempting to teach yourself the language?
I was hoping you wouldn't remember that.
See, I do actually listen to our panellists.
I'm really impressed, I have to say, and touched that you remembered. Yeah, I'm very slowly learning to speak Japanese. I can't yet say in Japanese, my Japanese isn't very good, but that's my next plan, next project anyway.
The only phrase of Albanian I speak is Nuk flas shume shkip, which means I don't speak much Albanian.
Very useful.
It's come in handy more than once. We will commence our deliberations here in the UK, where there is what the present government could consider good news and less good news. The good news is that inflation, somewhat to everyone's surprise, dropped somewhat in December from 2.6% year-on-year to 2.5%, teasing the prospect of an interest rate cut which might ease the slumbers of mortgage holders. The less good news is that the first YouGov poll of voting intention since July's general election puts Labour on just 26% and barely a squeak ahead of Reform UK, the current flag of convenience of what has previously been known as UKIP and the Brexit Party, and who have made a video.
As you can quite clearly see from those 3 young men, we are a party of the future of British politics, and things are about to change.
Rachel, are you convinced?
Oh, I think we've all got too addicted to polls. And I think every time a poll comes out, and I'm going to talk about the poll in a minute, but every time a poll comes out, it's worth remembering that we are 4 years out from an election and a lot can change. And obsessing
208 weeks is a long time in politics.
It's a really long time in politics. And sort of obsessing over ups and downs in polls, I don't think is very healthy for any of us. But let's do it anyway. A couple of things that were interesting about this YouGov poll. One is that the Conservatives and Labour together, the two main parties, are on less than 50%. And I think that is a trend that we're going to want to watch. You know, does a ostensibly two-party system with a first-past-the-post voting system work when the two main parties are below 50% combined, and when you've kind of got three parties vying for sort of 25% of the vote, and actually possibly 4, because the Lib Dems are also in other polls making gains as well. So kind of does our parliamentary first past the post system work when the electorate is fracturing in that way? And that's a really interesting kind of trend to watch. The other thing to watch, I think, is Reform trying to cement themselves as the de facto opposition, because yes, this poll is very bad for Labour in terms of popularity, falling, whatever, but they still have a massive majority. Like they're going to be okay. Reform have 5 MPs, the Conservatives have 121 MPs, but Reform are kind of fighting for the narrative that if you don't want Labour, they are the main alternative. And as you heard in that video, anything that they can use to promote that messaging, the row with Kemi Badenoch over Christmas about membership numbers, about Reform surpassing the Tories on membership numbers, the attention that they're getting or not getting from Elon Musk on the other side of the Atlantic, like anything they can do to kind of say there's only really space for two parties, one of them's in government, the other one's us, that's going to help them with their messaging and with their narrative. And the Conservatives haven't really figured out a way to deal with that yet.
Simon, I think it's generally understood that Labour's victory in July, landslide though it was not due to any great outpouring of love for the Labour Party and its leader Sir Keir Starmer. It was merely that the voters were transcendentally sick of the people who'd been running the shop for the last 14 years. But nevertheless, to see support tailing off like this so quickly, is there a clear reason for that, or are we again, as we have so often this century, just seen voters refusing to understand that you can't fix absolutely everything that's wrong with the country in 6 months?
I think, as you say, certainly one of the reasons why Labour did so well, it's been described as a loveless landslide because it was a huge number of seats they won, but many of them just by the smallest margins, and their share of the vote was smaller than any government's had before, in the sense that if you look at the representation in the House of Commons versus the number of votes cast, this is a complete mismatch, which is difficult. I think a lot of people, and I was talking to some Tory MPs just before Christmas, are quite surprised by the fact that it comes back to this fact that Labour doesn't seem to have much of a plan in office. It doesn't seem to have much of a sense of what it wanted to do. And it does seem remarkable that they had so much time to think about this. And I think that's making some Labour MPs unhappy as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why the government is particularly unpopular. I mean, they've lost half their support in percentage terms anyway, which is really quite remarkable at this stage. A lot of it, I think, obviously is about the economy. I have to say, I think Kemi Badenoch, to go on about this grooming and gangs thing, I think just leave that to Elon Musk and X, focus on the economy, because that is much more serious for Labour. And I think one of the reasons why the government is so unpopular is this concern about interest rates possibly rising. And then also, of course, if things go the way they are, it may well be that Labour will have to inflict some pretty serious public expenditure cuts next time in the next few months, and that will be particularly difficult for the party. It's interesting that John McDonnell, who had been shadow chancellor under Jeremy Corbyn, very much to the left of the party, was just saying yesterday that these kind of cuts would be suicidal. So I think if the party, if the government is forced to implement expenditure cuts, and they will do unless Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, throws her fiscal rules out of the window. If they do that, I think you'll find a lot of very unhappy Labour MPs from the left.
Is it in fact arguable, Rachel, that Keir Starmer at this point has no greater friend or ally than Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party? Because she does seem to be one of those people who does completely fail to understand that Twitter is not, or X as we now call it, is not in fact real life.
Yeah, she's certainly doing him a couple of favours at PMQs, which I watch daily. And today she had every open goal imaginable that you could throw at Labour. That's mixing sports metaphors, isn't it? And she managed to miss all of them. Or she tried. And the interesting thing about her as a leader is when you think about would somebody else be better, is every time she tried to attack the government, Starmer could just throw it back at her and say, we're in this mess because of you guys, 14 years, £22 billion black hole, etc., etc. And she hasn't really figured out a defence against that. And it's difficult to see how a different Conservative leader could do that. They're in a difficult position at the moment because, yes, Labour's popularity has tanked, but the Conservatives' popularity hasn't risen in response. And if you drill down into the data about where those Labour voters from 2024 are going, they're not going to the Conservatives. So it's not simply the case that unpopular government, more popular opposition. I think she hasn't really found a way to capitalise on that and a way to neutralise the Conservatives' toxic record yet.
I mean, is there an argument as well, Simon, that there is a pattern, as has been widely discussed, of various Western democracies lurching somewhat towards the far right? Is it possible that the parties most threatened by that are not, in fact, centre-left Social Democrats like the Labour Party, but actually the old-school establishment Conservative parties who, even if they try, as Kemi Badenoch clearly is, to wear some of the populist right's outfits, it doesn't quite ring true with the sort of people who are excited by that kind of thing.
It is interesting, isn't it, that so many of the governments across Europe, the EU especially, do have a hard right as part of a coalition or working there. And I'm thinking of, for instance, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who, is still in power since October 2022, is now seen as a sort of a key right-hand aide of Ursula von der Leyen, for instance. But it's really, really difficult, this. I think we've seen, again, from other countries across Europe, attempts by the centre-right to form a coalitions, or at least to try and pick off voters from the hard left. You think of Valérie Pécresse in the French presidential elections in 2022. She tried to win votes from the National Rally. Didn't work for her. She finished in 5th place and got less than 5% of the vote. We've seen also Germany, Friedrich Merz is trying to win votes from the hard right AfD, but in fact he doesn't seem to be doing very well. The AfD, meanwhile, is doing really well. So it is very tricky. I mean, I think there are certain things, obviously, that the centre-right and the hard right have in common. Immigration, the boats in our case, or unfair immigration as it's seen, is a key issue. There's wokery, which is another common concern of theirs, even though that does seem to be falling down the agenda. But beyond that, actually, the centre-right tends to be economic liberals, very much in favour of free markets, limited immigration, very much the traditional view of the right, whereas the hard right, this new hard right, is very much isolationist, both in terms of trade and also sort of foreign policy. You think of how sympathetic, especially the new Freedom Party and, newly elected or about to be elected into government, very possibly the Freedom Party in Austria, very much pro-Russia. So, there are similarities, but then there are big differences, and I really wouldn't envy the leader of any centre-right party who's trying to appeal to that hard right.
Well, to Spain now, which is scarcely alone in the developed world in grappling with something of a housing crisis, or indeed in proposing solutions to it which seem unlikely to make much in the way of difference. Spain's Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, has announced a tax of 100% on the value of Spanish properties bought by non-Spanish residents from outside the EU, though this does seem amusingly likely to thwart the retirement plans of some who voted for Brexit back in 2016. It is less clear that it will have any great dramatic impact on housing in Spain. Population 48 million. In 2023, this stricture would have applied to just 27,000 purchases. Rachel, you will doubtless be familiar with the politician's syllogism, something must be done, this is something, therefore we must do it. Is this that?
they're not alone in trying to do this. And I want to start there because there are similarities, I think, with us here in the UK, with housing crisis, with young people really struggling to buy, let alone even to rent homes, and with high numbers of wealthy people, whether they are from that country or from another country, buying up property as an investment and then renting it out, whether it's holiday homes or whether it's sort of investment rental properties. And you've seen, I think, everywhere from New Zealand to Cornwall, local politicians say, local homes for local people. We want to stop overseas buyers or even buyers who aren't from here but who don't see it as a home, they see it as an investment. We need to stop that and sort of help local people who really can't get in the housing ladder. The thing that they don't talk about as much, maybe because it's less politically popular than saying blame the foreigners, is building more houses. Now, my geography of Spain is a little bit sketchy, so I don't know if these holiday touristy areas, my guess would be that there are some housing issues there. You've also got housing issues in cities or whatever. You can't just look at the whole overall number of houses in a country and say, these ones are holiday homes, therefore bad. But I imagine that they have similar pressures on house building that we have here, which is any time anyone wants to build new houses for young people where they actually want to live, you probably get opposition from people who already live there going, no, my views, too much congestion. And really, it's all kind of tinkering around the edges when what we kind of have to accept is that if we don't want to have housing crisis, we need to build some homes.
But is there also a trap here which... this strikes me, Simon, as one of those things that if there was a way of fixing this, somebody would have fixed it by now. Pedro Sanchez has said the West faces a decisive challenge to not become a society divided into rich landlords and poor tenants. It's very, very hard to argue with that. But the reality is that if you are the leader of a democratic country, even if you do devise some means of tanking the housing market to the point at which it becomes affordable for those people who cannot presently afford it, you are going to get voted into oblivion at the next election by people who already do own properties and likely have mortgages on them.
It's a difficult circle to square, isn't it? I have to say, I think investment properties is the key here, because I remember doing a story on real estate in London and talking to an estate agent who was very honest. And he said, listen, I've had two clients in today. One is a young couple. They're in a chain. They're trying to sell their current home to buy this place. They're looking to get their financing sorted out, all this sort of very complicated stuff. He said my other buyer is a Chinese investment buyer who's come in and said, actually, I want 10 properties, please. Actually, I'll tell you what, I'll make it 12. I'll have 12 properties. No problem with chains, no problem with finance. Just show me where to sign. And the estate agent said, which would you do in terms of, or which would you favour in terms of, the commission you're getting? So I think investment is key. It's interesting, isn't it, that Canada has taken a similar line. From 2023, Canada introduced wide-ranging ban on the purchase of residential property by non-Canadians. Again, when I was doing property stories, I discovered something similar in Denmark. So I am probably by nature a liberal, a free marketeer, but I think I certainly have sympathy anyway for this idea that if you want to come buy a home in a country, you've got to show that you're going to live there, make a commitment, buy stuff from the local store, and form sort of relationships with your local community.
Well, to Australia now, which not for the first time in its history is doing a pretty convincing impression of a lavishly blessed place, rather struggling for subjects about which to get wound up. The overlords of a chain of public swimming pools in the Blue Mountains to the west of Sydney have occasioned an amount of brouhaha with an edict forbidding overly immodest swimwear. They are vexed, they have made clear, not by bikinis on women or Speedo-style briefs on men, but by G-strings on either. The clear subtext being, come on, this isn't France. Rachel, where are we on this?
So I find this is a really interesting philosophical question because if I wandered around a city centre, let's say a warmer city centre than London, in my underwear, I would get some pretty odd looks. And yet there are places in the world where I could wander around in a bikini that was skimpier than my underwear and no one would think that was weird. And I find sort of the philosophical distinction that something is revealing if it's in cotton, but not if it's made in fluorescent swimwear fabric, really interesting.
I mean, you are completely correct, and I can report from a recent visit to Sydney. In fact, I went to have lunch with some friends near Manly Beach, and you do see people just walking up and down the main shopping precinct, wearing not very much at all.
But they don't wear cotton underwear to do that, because that would be weird.
Apparently that would, and that is a good point. It is getting quite a lot of coverage, both in Australia. I mean, obviously the swimmers aren't, but the story is, Simon, getting quite a lot of coverage.
Both, some of them should have more coverage, I imagine.
Both in Australia and in the world at large. Do we suspect that this may be because not because of the gravitas of the story as such, but because of the opportunities it presents to picture desks?
Well, I was going to say, actually, just as we were sitting outside waiting to come in, I did make the big mistake of typing in mankini and then clicking on images in Google, and you really don't want to do that.
That's not a work computer, is it?
No, probably. No, that's the great thing about being freelance. I can look at anything. So, so I think there's probably a joke about divisions and splits, isn't there, and thongs, but I won't make it. But also interesting, I thought that in France, actually, you're only allowed to wear Speedos in public pools, or in some public pools in the country anyway, because the kind of shorts that I would prefer are considered a sort of baggy. They take up too much water. I don't know. They could absorb water, which is then spilt by the side of the pool or something. So the thinking is, looking very sceptical.
That is not why they came up with that rule. That may be the official justification, but the person who came up with that rule, I'm willing to bet cash money,
just want to see people
had other motivation. Exactly.
I mean, is it clear? I mean, the thing is, it does strike me, Rachel, I'm sympathetic to the extent that a swimming pool does have to, at some level, impose some standards, because otherwise there is nothing stopping people from coming in naked.
Well, my thought is always that the bikinis or Speedos that are as skimpy as you suggest, they just don't look comfortable for swimming, do they? So if you want to wear something and take pictures and post them on Instagram, that's one thing. If you want to wear something in a public swimming pool or on a public beach because you are swimming, then I feel like a little bit more fabric. I mean, it's a safety risk, I think, to go swimming, especially on a beach where there's sand and jellyfish and stuff. But you Australians you're weird about this anyway, because you'll wear shorts to work, won't you?
Well, I mean, it's not a practice I approve of myself, but people do, yes.
I just think I don't understand the Australian mindset.
And flip-flops as well.
Flip-flops, which they call thongs.
Oh,
we do call them thongs.
So a guy coming into the office wearing a thong would be...
And I am able to report from recent weary experience that there are those, I am embarrassed to say, of my fellow citizens...
both types of thong.
...who consider this appropriate attire for long-haul flights.
No.
Yeah, genuinely.
No.
Shorts and flip-flops for 12 hours on a plane.
And it gets really cold with the air conditioning as well. I don't understand your people.
Well, I will give you something else about my people not to understand, because I do actually enjoy introducing to non-Australians the kind of things that Australians think of as great nation-dividing controversies. The Prime Minister has weighed in on this particular one, no less. He may not have enough to do. This is the practice of putting cabanas on public beaches, Simon, therefore annexing a portion of sand for your exclusive use. There are people, including our Prime Minister, who believe this to be downright un-Australian.
It might be un-Australian. I think it's very British, I have to say. I mean, why not? An person's home is their castle or whatever, so why not do it? Interesting.
British is just another way of saying un-Australian.
Un-Australian, something completely different. Also interesting, I suppose, it depends how beaches fill up, because I was doing some research for a story a few years ago, and I discovered that in Britain, and perhaps this is in Australia as well, I don't know, it's like a pandemic. Some will go and sit on one end of the beach, and somebody else will go and lie as far away as they can on the other end of the beach, and people finally sort of fill in the gaps, if you like, whereas in Spain and Italy, not France, Spain and Italy, people gather together. So it's like, there's a group of people lying on the beach, and other people will sort of attach themselves to the side, and it sort of grows. The beach population grows in that way, which is quite interesting. So that would make a cabana quite difficult, wouldn't it? Whereas if you take that British approach, where I want to have complete distance from everybody else on the beach, then you can have your own cabana, perhaps with sort of sides and control towers, flashing lights, sort of
would you be a cabanaist, Rachel, given the chance?
If it was somebody else's, sure. I don't like hassle.
Sneaking into somebody else's?
No, somebody else having theirs and then inviting me. I'd be like, oh yes, this is delightful.
Okay.
But I don't like stuff. I don't like hassle. And it seems, I can barely remember my sun cream and my water bottle when I'm going to the beach. To have to lug a sort of temporary structure, I don't get it. I think it's interesting that you said it was British, because it's actually very German, isn't it? It's like putting your towels on the sunbed, putting your cabana on your bit of sand. But really, I think you've just chosen this story to remind us that Australia has lovely beaches and people just hang out on them after work or whatever in January, the darkest, coldest.
And at this time of year,
London,
as I can also report from recent experience, it's warm and pleasant. And honestly, what are we all doing here? Rachel Cunliffe and Simon Brooke, thank you for joining us nevertheless. Finally, on today's show, our On This Day historical series considers the moment that Saddam Hussein's time ran out, version 1.0. Interventionism, as an idea, has had a lousy 21st century. For the purposes of this lecture, interventionism is the intervening by democratic countries in the affairs of countries which do not meet that definition. It is not difficult to see why the idea has fallen into disrepute. In late 2001, the United States and its allies invaded Afghanistan to roust the Taliban. Roughly 20 years, thousands of lives, and trillions of dollars later, the United States and its allies gave Afghanistan back to the Taliban. In 2003, the United States and its allies invaded Iraq to, according to the sales pitch, topple a tyranny and inaugurate liberty. The tyrant was swiftly toppled, literally and figuratively.
Then the moment of history. Saddam's regime could finally be said to be at an end.
But that short-term gain was abundantly offset by subsequent decades of violent chaos. In 2011, NATO saddled up to avert a massacre in Libya as loopy despot Muammar Gaddafi attempted to forestall a revolution, but failed to impose or encourage any coherent post-war settlement in a country with a population about the size of Toronto, almost all of whom live along a single coastal highway. The case for staying out of stuff has become the conventional wisdom.
Keep going! But Mr. Obama brushed off calls to pour thousands of U.S. troops into Iraq and Syria, saying that would only repeat past mistakes.
But for a brief period in the late 20th century, interventionism seemed like it was going to be, well, as someone put it at the time,
a new world order where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law.
The idea was formed almost on the wing, prompted by the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq in August 1990. In a scenario which may seem vaguely familiar to present-day listeners, in Ukraine in particular, the paranoid ruler of a dysfunctional petrostate ordered the invasion of a smaller neighbouring nation which he regarded, inaccurately, as a temporarily rogue province of his own.
Well, at this hour, Iraq remains in firm control of the tiny oil-rich country of Kuwait, and there is no indication that those Iraqi troops, some 100,000 of them, will be leaving soon.
At this point in history, there was only one outside player whose opinion mattered. The Cold War had recently ended. The Soviet Union would shortly cease to exist. The United States was the sole superpower, the Western democratic bloc, the dominant hegemon. In Washington, D.C., now the de facto capital of Earth, a decision had to be made. Among the administration of US President George H.W. Bush, the consensus was somewhere between pragmatism and cynicism. One official likened Iraq's seizure of Kuwait to a gas station changing owner. It was reportedly President Bush himself who asked his circle the key, agonizing question which has underpinned every similar deliberation since. What happens if we do nothing? Whatever answers were furnished, Bush was unsatisfied by them. Iraq was given an ultimatum, leave Kuwait or else, and a deadline, January 15th, 1991.
Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait completely, immediately, and without condition.
Bush, unlike a later US president of that name, had none of the cowboy in him. He was an almost comically proper establishment figure, decorated fighter pilot, Yale graduate, oil baron, congressman, ambassador to the UN, director of the CIA, vice president, now president. He assembled a coalition of 42 nations, including several Arab and/or Muslim countries, who spent months assembling their legions in Saudi Arabia. He secured the legal authority of a string of UN Security Council resolutions. It was UNSCR 678 which gave Saddam Hussein until this day 34 years ago to turn his tanks around. Saddam Hussein did not.
Now we hear planes actually going over here.
Yeah, well, I'll see if I can see anything. All right. There's a plane nearby. Bernie, you can see something?
Right. It's broken out on either side of us here at the hotel. And I'm just going to be quiet and let you listen.
It was all over by the end of February. Operation Desert Storm was a comprehensive rout. The invader was repelled, the occupied nation liberated, international law upheld. Bush's hubris did not, in the circumstances at the time, seem all that hubristic.
We went halfway around the world to do what is moral and just and right. And we fought hard, and with others, we won the war. And we lifted the yoke of aggression and tyranny from a small country that many Americans had never even heard of. And we asked nothing in return. We're coming home now, proud, confident, heads high. There is much that we must do, at home and abroad, and we will do it. We are Americans.
But Bush's own crucial question, what happens if we do nothing, kept being asked. It was asked by the immediate aftermath of Desert Storm, as Iraq's Kurds and Shia rebelled against Saddam with considerable courage and at monstrous cost. And it turned out the reply, as the New World Order saw it, was, who cares? It was asked in the 1990s by Somalia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Rwanda and Kosovo, among others, and the answers rarely seemed quite as decisive as they had where Kuwait was concerned. Parallel universes are a game one can play all day, of course, but consider a hypothetical trajectory in which, in 1991, the United States and its allies had flown their bombers home via Vukovar, where the armies of Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic were laying siege and stopped the Yugoslav wars before they had properly started. Many are the analysts who have noted the radicalizing effect the pillaging of Bosnia-Herzegovina had on a generation of European Muslims, and argued that the path to 9/11 runs through Sarajevo, Prijedor and Srebrenica. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Rachel Cunliffe and Simon Brooke, also to Nimrod Goren in Jerusalem at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.